Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I thought I would sit down and talk about some of my reading goals and resolutions that I have for 2022, including some BookTube plans that I have for the coming year. I spent a big chunk of 2021 being stressed and depressed and anxious, which I'm sure some of you out there might be able to relate to. But because of that, I didn't have the best reading year in terms of number of books read. I only read about 33 books this year, which is on the lower end of some of my recent reading years. I think in better years, I've been reading closer to like 50 or 60 books. And I also didn't have the best year on BookTube either. I actually spent a lot of 2021 pretty ready to quit BookTube. And I think looking back, that defined my feelings about my reading year in 2021, almost more so than the books themselves, if that makes sense. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to the BookTube plans section of the video. But first, some general thoughts about my 2021 reading overall. Like I said, I didn't read as many books as I normally do this year. I didn't even get close to my Goodreads goal, which is completely fine. I'm never particularly fussed about my Goodreads challenge. I think that if anything, I kind of make it in January based on whatever amount of optimism I'm feeling at the end or beginning of the year. And then I just think it's kind of a useful tool to be able to pull up all of the books that you've read so far this year easily on the trash app that is Goodreads. So generally not super concerned with the number of books I'm reading in any given year. I think this year, if anything, I was just a little bit bummed because I ended up having more reading slumps in terms of weeks where I just wasn't reading at all, or long periods, especially this fall, where I just wasn't excited about anything that I was reading. And that was too bad, just in the sense of it being an indication of how kind of drained and exhausted and unexcited about things I was generally for a lot of this year, and how I often didn't feel like I had energy for this thing that normally brings me a lot of joy and kind of rejuvenation. But one of the silver linings, and this is something I mentioned in my best books of the year video, is that despite the lower number of books that I read this year, I think that it was a really high quality reading year. I was actually surprised in looking back at it how many new favorite books and new favorite authors came out of my 2021 reading. And interestingly, and somewhat surprisingly to me, I guess, a lot of the books that ended up on my favorites of 2021 list stemmed from some of my 2021 reading goals. So let's look back at those for a quick second. Last January, and also just generally over the past few years, I have been setting reading goals kind of around topics and authors that I potentially want to explore in the coming year, rather than around kind of quantitative benchmarks. I've mentioned this in the past, but I love kind of getting into grooves of reading where you're reading interrelated books one after the other, or kind of in close succession. And last year, I, in retrospect, rather ambitiously listed off 10 topics and authors to explore in 2021. Just to recap, those topics were reading more sci-fi and fantasy books, reading more books by Indigenous authors, books about the Balkans, reading some books inspired by Nothing Ever Dies by Viet Thanh Nguyen, so books about Cambodia and Vietnam. I was also hoping to read more books by Edith Wharton, Toni Morrison, and Yasunari Kawabata. And then I did also specifically say that I wanted to read the Iliad by Homer and A Feeling for Books by Janice A. Radway. So a lot of that did not happen at all. I did not read any books by Toni Morrison, Edith Wharton, or Kawabata. I did not read any books about Vietnam or Cambodia, and I most certainly did not end up reading the Iliad or A Feeling for Books. However, I did end up doing fairly well on those 4 other categories. I did read more fantasy this year. I read The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, and then I read a couple of books by Guy Gavriel Kay, who ended up being one of my favorite new authors of this year. I also did read some sci-fi this year. I read Exhalation and Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang, which again were both some of my favorite books of the year. I did read several books by Indigenous authors this year. I read Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich, Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley, Playing Indian by Philip J. Deloria, and then I ended off the year with Medicine Walk by by Richard Wagamese, which was one of my absolute favorite books of the year. And I similarly read a handful of books about the Balkans and by Balkan writers over the summer. So those books were Catch the Rabbit by Lana Bastasic, Ministry of Pain by Dubravka Ugrasic, and My Heart by Semestin Memedinovic. So in total, 13 of the 33 books I read this year ended up being related to some of my 2021 reading goals, which I think is pretty good for a year that was otherwise kind of a trash fire. In terms of my 2022 reading goals, I am once again hoping to focus around particular topics and authors this year, but this time I am going to set a more modest list for myself. In terms of authors, as a kind of continuation of my 2021 reading, I would love to read more books by Richard Wagamese and Guy Gavriel Kay. I ordered some of both of their books from Abe Books this fall, and so I have them ready to go on my physical TBR. And those are also two authors who I would potentially love to make author spotlight videos about in 2022. And similarly, keeping with my 2021 reading, I would also love to continue reading books about the Balkans and by Balkan authors. In my recent bookshelf tour, I mentioned wanting to read Kin by Miljenko Jurkovic this year, which is a big, fat book about the Balkans and kind of Miljenko Jurkovic's family's history over the course of many decades and generations in Yugoslavia. And so that is a book that I definitely want to read. And then in addition to that, and maybe even before that, I would also love to read a chunkier and more comprehensive history of the Balkans. I was actually at the library recently looking for a totally different kind of book, and then happened across the Balkans Southeastern European history section of the shelves, and I found two really big books that I think might fit the bill. I need to dive into them a little bit more to see if I want to read either of them in full, but one of those is The Balkans by Misha Glenny, and the other is The Great Cauldron, A History of Southeastern Europe by Marie Janine Kalich. And in that vein, one of the other big goals that I have for 2022, which I again spoke about a little bit in my bookshelf tour, is that I really want to focus my nonfiction reading this year on big, chunky nonfiction, and I want to give myself the space and time to read those books potentially slowly and over a long period of time, and to just kind of savor the experience of it. This idea kind of first came to mind earlier this fall when I was reading a library copy of Brooklyn, the Once and Future City by Thomas J. Campanella, which is a book that has been on my radar for over a year. I've been wanting to read a bigger, chunkier book about Brooklyn, and so I had this checked out for about 3 weeks. The type is pretty small, and so when I had it checked out from the library for a few weeks, I only got through maybe 130 pages of the 450 pages here. But it was so fun and nice to kind of wake up in the morning and just sit and read through a chapter or half a chapter and really just soak in the kind of interesting anecdotes and tidbits that are in this book. And I just really had a great time with it. And then I had to return it to the library and got caught up in some other reading. And so I only just checked it out again. But I think that that initial experience this fall really made me want to kind of approach nonfiction in that way this year, in terms of dipping in and out of these bigger books. So yeah, chunky nonfiction 2022 is definitely a big goal. I'm not sure yet if I want to make a more formal project out of it and do kind of videos and check-ins about it as I go along in some of these books. I think I'll have to kind of think about it. I'm not sure if that would be of interest to any of you out there, but if it would be, let me know. And also I would love to know if you've read any chunky nonfiction in recent years that you would really recommend. And then lastly, I am going to say very loosely that I would like to read more classics in 2022, because I was looking back at it and I have not read a book written before 1960 since June 2020, and I haven't read a book written before 1900 since October 2018, which was shocking to me, even though if I think back on it, it makes complete sense. So I'm not saying that those classics necessarily have to be written before 1900, but this year it would just be nice to get myself back into the habit of picking up some older books and classics every once in a while. And then a more general reading life goal for this year is to read a little bit every day. I usually try to avoid super rigid goals like that, but I think it would be a nice thing to aspire to, just to kind of help myself avoid some of those slumps that I fell into. I think sometimes just trying to get yourself to read even 10 minutes a day, even when you're really not in the mood for it, can sometimes help you skim over some of those bumps. And I think it could also potentially help aid my overarching goal for this year, which is to think less. Reading obviously does require some brain power, but I think it can also sometimes distract you from your own thoughts. And so that is another reason why I would like to read a little bit every day. In terms of BookTube goals and resolutions for 2022, as I mentioned at the top of the video, I was pretty down on BookTube for much of 2021, or at least down on my BookTube channel specifically. And I was pretty ready at various points to just kind of call it a day. I think I spent a lot of the year feeling not excited about BookTube, and also feeling like this channel or my experience on it or the things that I had to say had run their course. And I think I was feeling that way for a few different reasons. The first is something that I have struggled with for the past couple of years, which is getting in a kind of like anxiety, perfectionism trap where I wasn't and haven't been able to make some of the videos that I've really wanted to make because I was hung up on my own unreasonable expectations for what the quality of those videos needed to be. You know, my approach to this channel has primarily been books and my thoughts on books, and less on like my sparkling personality or whatever. And I think that's actually been a really healthy emotional boundary in terms of, if my content is mostly focused on books and my thoughts on books, then I'm fine if people want to have their own opinions or judgments about that in terms of whether they like it or don't like it, or whether they find it useful or not useful. If it's me, the person, and my personality that are being evaluated, then that feels like there is a lot more at stake emotionally. At least that's kind of how I've thought about it in my head. But so I think that I ended up sort of overemphasizing this idea in my head that I needed to really prepare the videos and really have something like really useful or like insightful to say about something, which is not something that comes 100% naturally. I've talked in the past about how, especially for review videos or discussion videos, I 100% word for word script those videos, and that's something I'm trying to back away from a little bit, even when it comes to videos like this that in theory should be more chatty and conversational. When I look back on the first couple of years of my channel, it's amazing to me that I was just like churning out these videos that people still watch and comment on, and videos that I'm really happy with. And I just don't know when or how exactly I got to this point where I was putting like so much pressure on myself. Maybe now you're getting some insight into why my personal resolution this year is to think less. But that's something that I would really like to get away from, because this is a really rewarding and meaningful creative outlet for me, and also a really rewarding and meaningful way to connect with people about books. Another thing that specifically became more of a thing this year, I think, was just being cognizant of like YouTube analytics and the algorithm in a way that I really didn't used to think about that much. Obviously everyone's like aware of the numbers of it all, I think, especially when you're first starting out. I think primarily the thing that I was always aware of the first few years was like subscriber count, because that's just the obvious thing to pay attention to. You know, I think that always felt like more of a bonus, or just like a nice thing on top of the sort of implicit enjoyment of making videos and also having online conversations with people about books. I've seen a couple other booktubers and also just creators in general talk about the sort of new backend that YouTube introduced. I don't know how long ago it was actually, but it really puts all of the analytics right in your face and also tells you whether things are going up or down. And it's really difficult to avoid any of that because it's just right kind of there when you log into the back end. If there is a way to avoid it that I'm not aware of, definitely let me know. But it puts not only subscribers, but also view count, time watched, click-through rate, whatever that is, just like right in your face. And I can see all of that stuff being useful if you're someone who has a business on YouTube or are making significant money off of YouTube, where you do need to optimize and maximize various things. I think for the kind of average small creator, it's often just like a bummer and quite discouraging, even when you're someone where it's like, in my mind, that was always something that I didn't really care that much about. But then it's like when you see it over and over again, it's hard to not have that become a bigger factor in how you feel about particular videos or your feelings about BookTube or YouTube generally. And I think another thing too is that BookTube has changed a lot in the 4+ years that I've been doing it at this point, and I think that it's good when things change and evolve. Maybe it's just the corner of BookTube that I've kind of been lurking in and consuming lately. I think I found myself thinking more about what BookTube looks like these days and whether the kinds of videos that I want to make are the kinds of videos that people still want to watch. And I think all of those things were honestly compounded by some mental health stuff that was going on this year that was not limited to my feelings about BookTube and was infecting kind of the way I was feeling about a lot of different things in my life. And so I think some of my anxiety in particular definitely amplified some of those doubts or like bad feelings that I was having about BookTube and YouTube. And I was definitely at least cognizant of that being a big factor in my overall feelings. And I think that's why I ultimately didn't like pull the plug and say goodbye forever, because I was aware of in 9 months you might feel a lot better and look back and be like, that was premature and regrettable. I did end up taking an unintentional 3-month break this fall, which I do think was ultimately a good and much needed thing. And I've been kind of surprised at how much I have enjoyed making the last few videos that I've made and getting back into the swing of things. And I think it was a real reminder and realization for me too that I definitely need some type of creative outlet outside of work, because work on its own is not enough to feed the soul. And so I'm feeling on the upswing generally in life and also in my feelings about BookTube, and I think it's one of those things where I just want to kind of stick with it and give myself the chance to kind of really try to make the videos that I'm most excited about this year and just see how I'm feeling about it over time. And then I think the other thing that really was a reminder to me of why I would like to keep doing BookTube is that, there were some books this year that I really loved and mentioned a lot, books like A Brightness Long Ago or Exhalation by Ted Chiang. And after talking about those books in various videos, a lot of you often circled back in the comments to say that you had read them and in many cases really loved them or enjoyed them. And I think that that is the type of thing that ultimately is like what BookTube and reading communities are all about. Jennifer from Insert Literary Pun here recommended A Brightness Long Ago to me after we had a terrible Poppy War buddy read, and she recommended that book to me, and it was my favorite book of the year. And if I wasn't on the bookish internet, I wouldn't know Jennifer. I wouldn't have those types of recommendations coming into my reading life, and then there also wouldn't be a way to kind of pass those recommendations on to other people. So it's kind of that loop of people being able to find books that they otherwise wouldn't find that I think is so rewarding about this community, which is also just a long way of saying thank you to everyone who watches and engages and comments and offers up your own book recommendations or your thoughts on books that have been mentioned here. I'm definitely a lurker myself, so I have all the appreciation in the world for people who just watch also. So all that's to say, after a somewhat rocky 2021 reading and BookTube year, I am really looking forward to the year ahead, both in terms of books that I'm hoping to read and also in terms of BookTube and some of the videos that I'm hoping to make. I'm definitely hoping to focus more on author spotlights and reviews and themed discussion videos this year, so we'll see how all of that goes. If there are particular kinds of videos that you most enjoy watching, or if you have any ideas or things that you would like to see, definitely let me know in the comments below. But generally, I'm just really happy and grateful to be back in a place where I am feeling excited about BookTube and optimistic about everything and ready to just read a lot and talk about it in the year to come. I feel like this video is a bit more like personal than I tend to get on this channel. I don't know if that's how it comes across to you all. I'm feeling a little bit vulnerable now after getting in my feelings about all of this. But you know, after the last 18 months, what can you really do? I genuinely hope you are all doing well and staying safe and hanging in there. Definitely let me know what some of your goals or plans or hopes are if you are the resolution making type. And if you are not that type, maybe just some of the books that you have kicked off the year with so far. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!